Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see you in this virtual session on 5G licensing best practice. My name is Cristian Gomez. For those who don't know me, I am Director of Spectrum Policy for Asia Pacific at the GSMA, and it's a great pleasure to connect with you during this session. Next slide, please. So in our agenda, we're going to be talking with you about 5G licensing best practice. We're going to have a look at some global cases on 5G Spectrum Awards. Then we're going to have an interactive session between the team and a regulator from the region, in this case, Hong Kong. And at the end, we're going to have a brief Q&A session as well to take questions from the floor. Next. Next. Thank you. So for those who are not familiar with the GSMA, we are the association that represents the interests of 750 plus mobile operators from around the world. And we have a global footprint with 12 offices worldwide. And the GSMA represents, as I mentioned, the interests of mobile operators, but we also engage with the wider mobile ecosystem. Next slide, please. So in this 5G licensing best practice session, some of the areas that we're going to be discussing are the bands of interest for 5G and the bands which are being licensed as pioneer 5G bands. So in this spectrum, we have coverage where we talk about sub 1 gigahertz spectrum. We have the mid-range band from 1 to 6 gigahertz, and this is the band which is capturing a lot of the attention, and a lot of the licensing processes are happening in these bands, particularly in 3.5 gigahertz. And then we have the bands on the high end, which are used for capacity and provide lower latency and are also good for backhaul. And I'm referring particularly to the millimeter wave bands. We have some global positions in relation to how these bands should be allocated in order to provide users with the best performance. So for bands in the mid-range spectrum, for example, we advocate for spectrum blocks to be assigned to each operator between 80 to 100 megahertz per operator. And in the millimeter wave range, we advocate for spectrum blocks to be assigned to each operator with a bandwidth of about 1 gigahertz. This is in order to achieve the peak performance that 5G users will expect from the technology. Next slide, please. And also, just as important as it is to identify the different bands which are necessary to realize the 5G vision, there is another component to that, is that those spectrum blocks need to be assigned on a contiguous basis to each operator in order to avoid fragmentation and reduce cost. We have here some of the aspects which are some of the benefits of the 3.5 gigahertz band, for example, and the relationship between having, for example, a block of 100 megahertz as compared to 60 megahertz in terms of the efficiencies and cost savings. Next slide, please. Some of the licensing challenges to address across all those bands, first of all, is they need to have a roadmap. So governments and operators can have a clear view in terms of when the spectrum can be made available, and the operators through that process will be able to know how to program their investments. So this is particularly important considering the 5G ecosystem that has different bands to achieve the vision, from millimeter wave through mid-range and also some low spectrum. Therefore, having a full picture on how the bands will be released is very important. Regulatory certainty in terms of allocation methodologies, the renewal procedure to be done early enough in order to provide that certainty for investment, and for the operators to know what's going to happen at the renewal when the licenses are going to expire is really important. And the third point is the licensing regime itself. For example, what's the resource pricing to be applied? This is particularly important because 5G technology is not cheap, it's expensive, and high spectrum prices will definitely have an impact in the end result, which is the actual rollout. And the preference by industry is to be assigned a band which are harmonized. This is to reduce equipment costs and also to lower the potential for interference across all the different bands. So most of the bands are discussed internationally and allocated already through the regular regulations. Next slide, please. So a particular focus on pricing, and I already mentioned this, there's been a trend over the years for developing markets to apply prices which are much higher than in the developed world. This works against the rollout of mobile technology in these markets, particularly because of the stage of infrastructure development. So it doesn't make sense to implement high spectrum prices in a market that is trying to expand coverage, for example. So that only creates a barrier for investment. And in the end, it prevents operator to expand coverage where it's more needed. So this is particularly important. And it's particularly troublesome in some parts of the region. So we are hopeful that going forward with the 5G implementations, the pricing aspect will be thought through in an appropriate way by governments in order to achieve the end goal, which is to have 5G at the lowest price and as soon as possible. Next slide, please. This is a slide that summarizes the licensing terms and conditions that we see as best practice. And we see these terms and conditions to be enablers of a good framework to roll out the technology. So starting with the duration, so the license term, we advocate for licenses to be between 15 to 20 years or more. This is to allow operators to recover their investment over the period of the license. It also allows for consumers to have certainty in terms of the availability of services. Also, technology neutrality, for example, is a very important aspect. Regulators should avoid earmarking mobile bands for specific generations of mobile, 3G, 4G, or 5G. This is because the pace of technology is much faster than regulation. So we have seen over the years that bands that have been earmarked for a particular technology have created problems in terms of conversion to a new technology, creating delays for the adoption of new technology, which in the end impacts on consumers having access to the latest technologies and revisions of the standards. The next important aspect is the use of coverage obligations. If these are not designed in direct collaboration with the operators, which have the know-how in terms of what can be done in the field, it can be actually be something detrimental to the deployment of 5G. And we also need to be conscious about different bands have different propagation characteristics and can be used for different scenarios. So applying blanket coverage obligations across different bands, it could be actually harmful in terms of the policy objectives in the vision of every country to achieve 5G coverage. Avoiding restrictive and onerous conditions, that goes hand in hand with the previous point. If conditions cannot be monitored, for example, or enforced, and then there's no point having such conditions. Therefore, it's better to have an environment which is flexible and it allows continuous improvement of the network. And the use of yearly fees to recover cost. They should be just that. It should be cost recovery and should not be to maximize revenues, because in the end, that will only harm the ability of the operator to have enough funding for further investment in deploying the network, and also reaching customers which are, for example, beyond the metropolitan area. So all of these aspects combined provide a process which creates certainty and service continuity and minimizes risks for investment. So this is very important to keep in mind, this licensing terms of conditions in terms of best practice, in order to ensure that the 5G vision in each country is actually achieved, and it's done through a collaborative process between regulators and industry. Next slide, please. And I will hand over the floor to my colleague, Peng Zhao, who is going to talk about global case studies for 5G spectrum awards.
Thank you, Christian. So yeah, as Christian mentioned, in my session, I will give you a few concrete examples of what we've seen so far in the 5G licensing and what we consider as a kind of a best practice from the regulatory perspective. So next slide, please. So just as a matter of introduction, so based on our own data, we've seen that, you know, up till end of last month, there's about 87 mobile operator who launched 5G commercially. And also there's a planning for a further 80 or 84 operators in the short term to launch their 5G really soon. So all in all, the 5G is you know, in its earnest and here. And we see that by region, you know, APAC is one of the leading region for the number of launches. Here you see on the bottom right side the number of commercial launch. But of course, Europe, they have a bit more, but the sheer scale of the APAC market put the region well in advance than Europe and any other region. Next slide, please. So from those 80 something commercial launch, we looked back at the different kind of licensing regime and what has been done by the regulator, and we identified a few examples that I want to share with you today. So first of the example is Saudi Arabia. So over the last 2-3 years, Saudi has made a number of spectrum available for the mobile operators, including the 700s, 1800s, and then, you know, especially in the last 2 years, especially 2018 and 2019, they made a big chunk of mid-band spectrum available for the mobile operator. So if you see 290 megahertz in the 2.3 and 2.6 gigahertz, and a full 400 megahertz contiguous in the 3.5 gigahertz. So what it means that they have 3 operators in Saudi Arabia, and in fact, each of them gets over, you know, about 200 megahertz of mid-band spectrum only, and we're not counting about the low spectrum and you know, 26 gigahertz as well. So if you imagine that, you know, we as mobile association usually recommend 80 to 100 megahertz per operator, and those operators have 200. So what exactly the difference does it make? So if you can just click on the next, we have a small chart coming up from OpenSignal, and that's the what we see from the OpenSignal 2 months ago. And you see on the bottom right, the rightmost kind of chart is Saudi download speeds. And you can see that it's easily 20-25% higher than the next one, which is South Korea, and a few other leading 5G countries as well. It means that, you know, the contiguous spectrum, especially, you know, in the mid-band, made a huge difference for the speed. Saudi was not that well placed in the download in the 4G era, but in 5G, they're definitely leading the pack for the time being. So we really encourage operators, regulators to make as much contiguous spectrum available per operators, and with a minimum of 80 to 100 megahertz in the C band, in the mid band. Sorry. Next slide, please. Next one is a slightly different aspect. The example of New Zealand and the latest assignment in the 3.5 gigahertz. So New Zealand has a plan for a while to assign the spectrum in that band for 5G this year, but it was planned as an auction. but due to COVID and after discussion between the regulator and the mobile operator there, it was decided to be assigned as a direct awards. And the key kind of policy goal for the New Zealand regulator was to get the spectrum out as quickly as possible, especially in this kind of context, so that all operator can use it and deploy that. If they want, the alternative would be to delay the auction or delay the assignment or getting more, setting really high price, etc. But it was really good for the consumer that the regulator decided, the spectrum that is unused was nothing, whereas the spectrum that is deployed fast and in the hand of the operators, that's the most useful for the community and for the society. So the mobile operator have access to those bands and has been starting to deploy 5G. And the key here is really the kind of a flexibility. The regulator have decided, instead of going to an auction, to run the direct awards. And it's really good to have that kind of a versatility and the flexibility from the regulatory perspective to address any kind of unknown challenges, just as COVID. Next slide, please. So next example is coming from Finland. So in Finland, again, in 2018, they made a lot of spectrum available in the mid-bands. So basically, they provided 130 megahertz of C-bands for each of the 3 operators. And then just recently, last month, 2 months now, they assigned the 800 megahertz, the 800 megahertz each in the 26 gigahertz auction. So as you know, they have 3 operators there, and they each have more than 100 megahertz of mid-band and 800 megahertz in the millimeter wave, and well within what we recommend as a kind of optimal 5G spectrum bandwidth. And also another thing to note is that the spectrum was gone at a reserve price, and really cheap. So 7 million euro for 800 megahertz bandwidth. That is unheard of before. And it's not from the regulator perspective. It's not because they think operators have limited financial capacity, but they really think that the whatever operators save as money to buy the license, they can make a much quicker and faster deployment in the 5G, because as you know, in the C-band and especially in the millimeter wave, the deployment capex is huge, and compared to the 3G and 4G era. So as a result, again, Finland has deployed all the 5G license spectrum so far earmarked for in Europe, and they have a really good kind of outlook to deploy that their 5G. Next, please. And one other example I want to give you a different aspect, but it's not really on 5G, but it's a kind of famous textbook example that we give always from Sweden. Is during the 4G era, when they assigned the license, there has been a consideration of enabling more wider coverage by the mobile operators. And as part of the licensing, the applicants for one of the license was one of the 3 licenses had a coverage obligation associated with it, but the applicant for that license were allowed to count their kind of a capex investments to deployment into the price. So at the end of that, it was a fairly kind of innovative model, and the coverage reached 99% with the 4G really fast in Sweden. And since that example, probably almost 10 years ago now, there have been a lot of more examples. For example, when I heard about Colombia on the 700 megahertz, mobile operators were allowed to spend 60 or 70% of the price they bid for the auction through commitment for network deployment in the different uncovered area. So more and more we see that kind of example. Next slide, please. So here just a few other examples that we see regulator has been really creative to address the coverage issue, and that's not only for 5G. That's in mobile broadband coverage in general. So one that I want to quote here is probably the one in France. So when France regulator considered the renewal of the license of the 3G, 2G, 3G, and 4G license for mobile operators, they said instead of paying for license renewal, they just wanted to have a commitment from the operator to cover more rural areas in France. And at the end, the operator probably spends a lot of money for the rollout in those areas, but that's the money they saved from the license renewal. So it is a good kind of hand-in-hand approach between operators and regulator, and the regulator has definitely a huge role to play in those kind of rural coverage. Next slide, please. So those were the few examples I want to give. Just want to mention that we have loads of other collaterals and material on the website about 5G spectrum, but also spectrum policy in general. So please just visit our website and to have a look. So next, I want to pass to my colleague, Joe Guan, who is the head of Greater China policy, and he will give an interview to Elaine from OFCA, Hong Kong. Joe, please.
Thank you, Bong, and hi everyone. So we're going to have a dialogue with OFCA, the Office of the Communications Authority of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been very instrumental in the last 2 or 3 years, in particular, in assigning 5G spectrum in the mid bands and the millimeter wave bands. And for today, we're very pleased to have Ms. Elaine Hui, who is the Assistant Director, Regulatory Affairs, and she oversees all of the 5G spectrum assignments in Hong Kong. And we're very pleased to have her to share her thoughts on, from a regular perspective, what the thought process was, as we heard from Christian and Peng earlier, from the industry perspective. So without further ado, I think my first question would be that as a regulator, what were OFCA's overarching objectives and considerations when you designed the 5G spectrum awards, in particular across different approaches across the mid bands and the millimeter wave bands?
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks, Joe, for the introduction. So, well, before I go on to the actual policy, perhaps I just briefly described, because it seems that the introduction would pertains me to do some introduction on what we actually did for the mid bands as well as the higher bands of spectrum assignment. So a brief summary would be that in 2019, we dish out around 4,500 megahertz of spectrum for 5G services. And for the mid-band, 380 megahertz of spectrum, we disposed of it kind of by way of auctions. And for the rest, 4,100 megahertz of 26 and 28 gigahertz bands, we made it available by way of administrative assignment. And the decisions were made, of course, based on the market environment, the different special characteristics of these bands and the availability of these bands, taking into account of consultations. And the overall decisions were actually made based on a very fundamental government policy, not just for 5 bands, but actually it's basically based on a spectrum policy of the government, and not just the regulator. OFCA is of the entire government, which was pronounced in 2007 as our spectrum overall policy, which is to make the spectrum available in the most socially, economically, as well as technically efficient manner, and to maximize the benefit for the community, and to introduce innovation and advancement of technology, which all these are in line with the regulator's role and function, which is to provide a vibrant communications industry and to introduce competition and innovation into the market. So with this overriding policy, and then how come we have these different approaches for different bands of spectrum? Then this is underpinned by another, enforcement of what we do is this. We are a true believer of market-based approach. So what this market-based approach means is that wherever the regulator considers that there is competing demands in the market for those spectrum available, then we would use a market-based approach to decide on how to assign the spectrum. And this is subject to this overriding public policy. But whenever there is competing demands, then we use a market-based method. And most of the time we use it by way of auction rather than tender, because we have been using auctions for so many years, and the industry is so used to that. But for those spectrums where our assessment is we do not see a competing demands, then there may be room for some other ways of assignment. And that's exactly how we decided that for the mid-bands, which is at the time we had 3.3 gigahertz, 100 megahertz of 3.3 gigahertz, and 200 megahertz of 3.5, and then we have 80 megahertz of 4.9. And after consultations, we came with a view that there's competing demand in market, and therefore we decided to use auctions. For the 4,100 megahertz of spectrum in the 26-28 bands, we did a market, sort of survey as early as in 2017, asking people to express their interest in those spectrum. And we then did a consultation exercise. And from the responses that we received, we considered that there wouldn't be, because of this ample amount of spectrum available, we came to a view that there's not going to be competing demands for those spectrum. And therefore, we decided to assign the spectrum by way of administrative assignment, which could be faster, and people would be happier because, so far we assigned 1,200 megahertz specifically for territory-wide services. And so far, because the spectrum is still not fully utilized, there's no fee in terms of the utilization of those spectrum.
Thank you, Elaine. I think in particular for the last point, I think from the industry perspective, we want more reasonable fees. If less, the less, the better for us. But I think also my takeaway is that as a best practice, I think having the spectrum policy, the overriding spectrum policy, is particularly important for us. That gives us the certainty for us to plan our investment and also to plan our deployment and the network strategies. Just following on from what you just said, in particular, when we look at different assignment approaches, we have auctions, we have direct assignments, we have tenders, and in many cases, that you have an issue of how do you balance the various objectives, particularly from governments and from us, from the industry. For example, in many markets, we have seen the fiscal target from the government or the parliament have overriding effect over anything else. What's your experience sort of in balancing out the various needs and the demands from both sides?
Right. Fiscal objective. Well, I've been, for preparing for this conference, I've been reading again our spectrum policy issued by the government, and of all the main objectives, I didn't see a specific objective in terms of extracting the biggest amount of money for our revenue. So in that sense, what we targeted to do if the spectrum is in competing demands is put it to the market, and for the market to decide the value of the spectrum. That's exactly what we did by putting all these 380 megahertz of 5G spectrums to auctions. And I would say that even though it costs, we have this spectrum utilization fees, but it was really a very reasonable price, judging from the responses of the industry, even by when the minister of it was our minister of this particular sector that decided the reserve price. So when the reserve price were announced for the auctions, everyone was happy. The operators were happy, and then at the end of the auctions, everybody got some spectrum, and they also issued announcements saying that they were happy with the whole process. So I guess from industry's point of view, we did a good job.
Yeah, yeah. I think very similar feedback we've received from members. That I think a lot of the auctions in the past few years has been, in particular, in a very consultative manner, that they are able to input their thoughts and their views on the auction designs directly to OFCA, and that being taken into account is very useful for us. So we have 1 minute left. So I just have one last question. So what do you have in the pipeline in the next 2 or 3 years? What spectrum going to have?
Right. For certainty purpose, we also annually issued a spectrum release plan for the next spectrum available for the next 3 years. So what we have in the pipeline would be the 600, 700 megahertz. That would be what we are using for the broadcasting bands available, and then some more 4.9 gigahertz bands available, as well as 2 reassignment exercise on 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz, as well as the 850 megahertz bands. And because we are adopting a technology neutral regime, so all these bands, subject to consultation, would be put out for assignment in certain ways, subject to consultation's decision.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Elaine. And we're gonna have, I'll keep you here. I'm gonna welcome back Christian and Peng as well. We're gonna have an open floor. Questions are already flowing in, so I'm gonna pick the ones I like. So the first one goes to Christian. Can you explain, Christian, if an operator only uses less than 18 megahertz, like you mentioned for mid-band for 5G, are their ecosystem ready now? It's from Rudy from Asiata.
Okay, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Rudy, thanks for the question. Yes, so the available equipment can adapt to the different bandwidths. So for mid-range spectrum, and particularly for 3.5, the available bandwidth starts from 10 megahertz, and it goes 15 and then 20, and then it has increments of 10 megahertz, so 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 100. So there is flexibility to implement a bandwidth which is smaller than 100. However, we advocate for going for the full block, or as big as possible, closer to the 100, in order to ensure the peak performance of 5G is available for the users.
Thank you, Christian. I've got another question. Let me see, I'm scrolling from my list, so many of them. From Dean, from Disruptive Analysis, how does the GSMA count national major operators as MNOs for the purpose of the presentation? The point being that do you localized operators such as enterprises also count as a mobile operator? I think that's a wider debate that we're having globally around the verticals, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can take that one maybe. I mean, of course, right now, the membership for GSMA is the 800 is the mobile national operators. There's a lot of hype with verticals and also private networks that's been assigned a spectrum in the kind of a core mobile band. And for this, I think I probably want to use 2 examples to see the difference. The 2 examples, one is from Germany and the other one from Finland. So as you may have heard, Germany have decided to license some of the spectrum in the kind of in the 3.5 gigahertz range for verticals, so the last I heard, I mean, they have maybe like 40 or 50 licensed applications, and they had some usage in that by manufacturer, so basically no MNOs. But apparently, when the BNets has been considering the millimeter wave now licensing, and they say, okay, we don't want to set aside any more spectrum for the vertical. I mean, the reason it can be, that's probably my interpretation, but you have a spectrum that is used in 50 small localities instead of to be used nationwide, and that just sterilizes a really key kind of core 5G bands for the for the wider usage by the public. But also in a different aspect, this use case maybe could be addressed by the MNO directly. I mean, MNO have not only access to this band, but they also have access to low frequency, but also high frequency. So have a full portfolio of spectrum that can be used to address different use case of one vertical user, and that could be addressed. And I think the danger really with the set aside like this is like to push for the scarcity of the spectrum. In Germany, the spectrum 5G spectrum was really high, the price. And if you compare to somewhere like Finland, then Finland has given access, as I showed earlier, 130 megahertz to each operators, and they ask them to to provide commercial agreement for vertical and address a use case there. But just finish with this comparison. Finland now is considering to some set aside for the millimeter wave in 26 gigahertz, and Germany not. In the case of Finland, we don't have too much issue with that. As I explained before, they give 3 licenses already of 800 megahertz each for the mobile operators. Operators have more than the optimal kind of bandwidth to deploy 5G in that band. And if there's more use by others, why not? But just not when the spectrum is not enough. I think that's our view on the vertical and set aside. And of course, there are various other considerations of coexistence, for example, TD synchronization, etc. I don't want to go too much into that, but you have more than all our position is on our website again.
Yeah, thank you, Peng. I think there's another question that is kind of related. I think that also corresponds to what Elaine was talking about, what Ofcom is doing, that the combination between mid and high bands for 5G auction is best practice, because we get good coverage and good capacity at the same time. This is best choice for MNO in APAC. Do we agree? And if we agree, do you explain how to get it for many countries in Asia, especially for countries that have more challenges in mid bands? I think that's more specifically around the C band, where we had many years of challenging situations, if I can say.
I mean, the question was for me, wasn't it? Or
for you, but I think that's also applicable for all. I think that's a fairly good question, I think.
So if I may just start really quickly, I think it's completely right. I mean, we always said for 5G you need a sub 1 gigahertz band, but mid band, but also millimeter wave for high throughputs. In APAC and especially ASEAN countries, there were a lot of issues to free up 3.5 gigahertz. But we really encourage to see that several countries in the region, by Thailand NBTC made a presentation earlier, but also Vietnam and Malaysia, etc. They all start considering how to free up more of those bands. Now the question is like, is it enough? So most of the country are able to free up maybe 200 megahertz, sometimes 300 megahertz contiguous bands. But if you're talking about 3 or 4 operators, you probably need more. So you need to consider all the other bands. That is what we consider as a mid band. So that includes 2.3, 2.6. Today, if you haven't licensed those yet, maybe you can consider those as substitutes. Exactly like what we presented for Saudi, where they pushed everything out more or less in succession. And also in the future, you have other bands, 4.8, 4.9. That's another band that is on the discussion for the BRC, and also the 6 gigahertz is another band, mid band, that is on the discussion for WRC23. So all those bands can come in the medium term to as a kind of a supply for this region if 3.6 is difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. We actually have now a new question from a regulator from Cambodia. Chia from the telecommunication regulator of Cambodia. I think we've met before, if I'm not wrong. So what will be done to generate revenue for 5G services at a level of developing countries? And are there any factors that we should study? I think that's a fairly interesting question, particularly I think that's an interesting question for both the regulator and for the industry ourselves. How do we actually make money out of 5G after we've paid for the spectrum?
Well, perhaps as regulator, as I started first, and well, as I said, for our purpose, we wanted more efficient use of spectrum for the general, benefits of the community. So, how much we earn from dishing out those spectrum wouldn't be of a really high priority for us. But so long as we put the spectrum to auction, then we got a market value from the operators. And what we actually do is, perhaps I could go on a little bit further, is to the government, apart from pricing, we also make available a lot of administrative measures to encourage operators to build up their sites. And we made available over 1,000 government premises for them for free to build up their 5G cell sites. So that's the extent that we are prepared to do to encourage their network coverage.
Yeah, I think giving out government sites will be particularly useful because site is the premium now. From the industry perspective, we have been having troubles, particularly for 5G, to actually get physical locations to install our sites. Now, speaking of you, Elaine, there's another question directly to you. You've mentioned that tech neutrality will be soon available for all bands and that you will still be debated via consultations. Can you give us more details on the decision process for this way forward and the expectations from OFCA, general benefits, and maybe something on pricing, if any?
The technology neutral approach has all along been adopted for in general for our mobile services. So apart from those 5G spectrum that we dished out last year, the existing spectrum 2.1 or the future spectrums are made available 850 and 2.5, 2.6. So the operators can always, there's no limits or no restriction on our license to stop them from refarming their existing bands to provide 5G services. So it's in that sense that whenever the operators feel ready, then they can move on to 5Gs using even their existing spectrum.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I might add just on that, I think it's really really good approach to have technology neutral, because as a regulator, you probably don't have a crystal ball, unless I'm wrong. You don't really know exactly what kind of service or what kind of new service may develop with a new generation of technology, and how that will adapt to your consumer or to your to the population in general. So allowing technology neutrality, and it's really good thing for operators because they can see the evolution of the demand on the application side or on the kind of common side, and to be able to make more efficient use of a particular resource like spectrum is really good to not delay any kind of 5G deployment in the future. And I think that's really something that needs to be adopted more widely. I know there's in the region, especially, there's quite a few operators, regulators, sorry, who still assign spectrum, who still have a previous license as specific to 2G or specific to 3G or 4G, and operators need to to ask or to pay more sometimes for more, but that's just prevent the kind of evolution of the technology, and I think that should be revised, this decision.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have about 2 or 3 minutes left, so I'm gonna take a closing question. It was directed to the GSMA, but I think there's also a very valid question for OFCA as well. To avoid high prices spectrum that occurs in many developing markets in Asia and elsewhere, what concrete steps could we take to help the industry to navigate around that so they have very efficient use of spectrum? And what will be your recommendations? So probably have 1 minute each. Probably I'll start with you, Elaine, from regulator perspective. What would you recommend?
Right. So we set the reserve price very reasonable, and it's up to the operators to decide how much they are willing to pay for that. And of course, under our license conditions, we have rollout obligations, and they have to do certain rollout obligations within the certain years, subject to a performance bond. So it's just to make sure that when they get the option, when they get the spectrum, they actually use it for the rollout.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. And I'm gonna go counterclockwise from my view. So Christian, you are next.
Well, I think the one of the most important aspects is to have a clear policy objective set up, and a lot of these spectrum outlooks, 3 to 5 year plans, for example, are quite useful, because having a visibility, for example, of when spectrum is going to be available, from one side it helps operators plan their investment, and on the other side, when the operators know what are the expectations of the regulator in terms of the rollout, it is made clear, or it can be made clear, that the regulator is actually working in collaboration with the operator in order to achieve a national outcome. And those national outcomes are usually not to raise revenue from spectrum. Those national outcomes are about advancing economic development. So when spectrum roadmaps are published and are developed in collaboration with industry, there is a unified vision about what's expected from the new technology, and then it becomes much more clear when it comes to the assignment process, what's the result that the government is looking for through the assignment, which is to achieve those visions and those goals laid out in the spectrum roadmap, which are generally not really linked to revenue maximization, which in the end of the day is only short term, while the real benefits are those obtained through a proper planning and allowing investment to take place properly during the term of the license.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Peng, over to you.
I don't want to repeat what Christian just said, so I think we're fairly aligned there. I mean, I just want to mention that the avoid scarcity and give probably long-term roadmap that's just give more certainty to the investment into the mobile sector. And we have on our website a lot of collateral, and especially studies that prove that high spectrum price is really detrimental for the adoption of a mobile technology and for the kind of coverage and quality of the network. So please have a look again on our website, and I think that's all the points that have been covered.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone who tuned in, and in particular, thank you, Elaine, for your great insights from Hong Kong, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.